Hi, welcome to the Oscar 2 installation video for Washington State. You'll find all of our training videos for Low Ridge On-Site technology products on our website at oscaronsite.com, as well as written summaries of everything. This presentation will just go over a number of things: what an Oscar 2 drain field is, how it's installed, the startup procedures to make sure that once it is installed, it's operating properly, and if you're a new installer, the certification process to be on Low Ridge's list for certified professionals. Here's a good picture of an Oscar drain field that's uncovered. You've got the drip coils there. And you can see that Oscar isn't necessarily just a name pulled out of thin air, but it does have an acronym essentially explaining what an Oscar drain field is: an on-site sand coil area recharge. There are just a handful of components of the Oscar 2 drain field. The first being those drip coils, that purple tubing. We have two different sizes of coils. The smaller size accounts for 50 gallons per day of design flow, and the larger size is double that, accounting for 100 gallons per day of design flow. The second is the sand. We generally spec out an ASTM C33 sand. The third component is the reverse flush headworks provided by Low Ridge. And the fourth, of course, is the tanks. The Oscar 2 is a proprietary technology, as the water with its specific dosing out to those drip coils going through the sand serves as a treatment technology as well as a final disposal. Here's a good overall skeletal outline of what an Oscar 2 system is. You can see right here at the beginning we have this labeled treatment vessel. Depending on the design that you have, it could be that that's just a holding tank, doing nothing but just being a settling tank. It could be a pre-treatment device. And then from here, 1,000-gallon pump tank. We have the reverse flush headworks right there, as you can see, one of the components, and that goes out to the drain field from there. So relatively simple system. Now here's a side view of the Oscar drain field itself. If you're looking at it from the ground, this red line here is representing the side of one of those coils, and so you can see that there's 6 inches of depth below in this picture. There's 6 inches of sand below before you hit the native soil, with an additional 6 inches on top of the coils. And here's a good view of our reverse flush headworks, most of which you'll see there will be a insulative liner on the inside already supplied. But the actual configuration of the headworks of the 5 solenoid valves and the 3 pressure gauges, disc filter, and flow meter will all be in one simple box provided just like this. Now here's a picture of an Oscar drain field after it's been installed and had at least a year of growing season. It's right here, but as you can see, in many cases it's able just to completely blend into and become an integral part of the homeowner's yard. So aesthetically it has that benefit to it. Now let's dive into the installation steps for the Oscar 2 drain field system. The first one is just to simply stake out the area that the drain field will be, called the basal area. Then to remove the excess organics. To be clear, if there's just regular grass growth that's not that high, it's fine to leave that sod there. But if it's wildly overgrown or it has a lot of debris, to remove that would be your next step, if that's needed. The basal area prep, which we'll go over what that looks like. Then to simply apply sand to that prepped basal area, to place and connect the coils, and then the final cover with sand. So staking out that basal area, make sure that the top edge of the drain field is on contour. So that area, that whole top edge, is all going to be at the same elevation, and that if there is any slope, it's going to be going down from that top edge. Usually the area is just going to be a simple rectangle, so it'll take 3 to 4 stakes to take care of the whole basal area. If your contour is on a curve, then it may take 3 to 4 stakes just on that top edge alone. So all depends on the site specifications, but that first step is just staking out the area so you know what area needs to be prepped. The next step to remove this loose organic material. As mentioned before, if you're in a lawn or pasture, that overgrown grass, go ahead and cut that down. Don't need to completely remove all the sod. And then in a forest, if there's leaf duff or debris, go ahead and remove that as well to make it easier to prep your basal area. Next step, prepping that basal area. So you're essentially just going to comb the area that you've staked out and create these speed bumps along the length, or the same direction as the length of the drain field. So you can see just using the forks on that mini, and these grooves are going, that's the length, that's the long way it's going that same direction. As you can see here, another example of that area being prepped. And some designs may have you digging down so that when all is said and done and all of the cover is done, it's able to be flush with the rest of the yard. That depends on the design, so don't automatically go and say, oh, you can do that to make it look nice. Go to your design and make sure that's okay, but know that in some instances that's possible. Another thing here to notice is the essential nature, like any drain field being prepped, that this soil be dry. And even if it's really light and powdery here, as you can see, it still makes a difference making those grooves, those little ridges or speed bumps, I like to call them sometimes. That still makes a difference. It allows that ground to be even more opened up and allow the water to penetrate that soil. As mentioned before, you can see that even in that dry soil that just seems to crumble apart as soon as you touch it, it's still making a significant and clear ridge there. And so having that's the important thing. You still have that difference being opened up there. Next, we're going to go ahead and apply the sand. We want the sand to be applied from the side. You don't want to have your mini or whatever it is that you're transporting the sand with to be driving on top of the basal area before there's sand on it. So, truth be told, this picture has it done as if they've driven on top of it, but you'd want to be dumping it over from the side. And then once you've done that, you can go ahead and start raking it out and making that all appropriate for the next step in placing and setting your coils. Another thing to note here, that the only area that needs to be level is where the coils will be going. Now the coils are either going to be 5 foot in diameter or 7 feet in diameter. So only that stretch of area is essential to be level. The rest of it only needs to have that minimum 6 inches of sand on that prepped basal area. So this next step is to go ahead and place and connect these coils. You can see that the coils are all going to be in a straight line, and the coils will be connected with this brown tubing. And you'll go ahead and connect as it makes sense the coils with your supplier flush line as it's spec'd out again by the design. And this shot should pan out and you can see the whole row of coils as it's connected to the supply and flush lines as represented by these 1-inch pipes on either side of the drain field. And as you can see, I was mentioning before, it's level where these coils are on this top edge of this sloping site, but the rest goes down. So this whole area doesn't need to be level, just where these coils are. You can imagine how much more sand you'd be ordering if this whole area needed to be level. One of the main questions that come with this is cover material. What can be on top of the drain field when all said and done? The only cover that's required is that additional 6 inches of sand on top of where the coils are. After that, you can use cover soil on top of the drain field. The limit and the thing to look out for is on the area on top of where the coils are. It's essential that soil, if you are putting any kind of soil on top of that area, that it is low in organics. Going down to Home Depot and getting this topsoil mix down here and capital letters in bold, underlined with exclamation points. Getting that topsoil mix. It's heavy in organics, meaning that any of the water that rises up from when those coils are getting water pumped out to them, it'll stay locked in there, and you'll have a perpetually mushy drain field. But you can use, cover soil, some bark, straw, some sod. You can put that on top of there. Less is more, no more than 2 to 3 inches. Truth be told, I think the easiest thing to do is just on top of the sand that's already there, go ahead and throw some grass seed on top of that, and it'll grow faster than anything else in that yard because it's getting nutrient-rich water constantly dosed out to that, and that'll be fine if they're fine with just grass growing there. But you have many options. If you are in a windy area, feel free to use a jute mat. That's fine. Vinca minor, that's fine. But those are your options. So you have a lot, but the key is, particularly on top of where those coils are, you don't want to use more than 2 to 3 inches of anything, and not at all a soil that's high in organics. The final step is the cover sand for the Oscar 2 system. So all you need, as has been stated before, is the additional 6 inches of sand to go on top of those coils. The rest of the area, as you can see, clearly dips over, and so you can feel free as an installer to use the artistic side of your job, to use any kind of overburden that you have left to feather that out and make it smooth on the outside as it gets to the rest of the grade of the yard or the surrounding area. But all that's required is that additional 6 inches on top of where those coils are, which you can see obviously is just going to be right down the middle here. In this instance, it's right down the middle. Just some of the benefits of an Oscar to give you an idea if you're a new installer in terms of what time to bid. Once you're familiar with the Oscar system, generally takes less than a couple hours to put these together with just a couple of guys. So for that fourth component of the system, the tanks. The septic tanks just need to meet the typical criteria that I'm sure you run into with other systems. It needs to be on the Washington Department of Health's list of registered wastewater containment vessels. In this system, you need to have a minimum of a 1,500-gallon single or double compartment tank. An important note to have, I know often it can be taught that you just need an outlet baffle or filter baffle at all times. You can use one. One is not required for the system, so not necessary. All of our approved list of septic tanks, where they're coming from, are all on our website at oscaronsite.com, so you can reference that, and you can go ahead and look at these three. I won't read them out for you, but that's what we're looking for. Generally, whatever septic tanks you're using, if you're using them for other technologies, generally that's going to be the same thing, but really check that list that we have for approved vessels on our website. So for what's going inside the tank, you can see that we've got a turbine pump that's supplied by Low Ridge. It's just straight pipe going out, elbowing to a union out of the riser, and it's sitting on the bottom of the tank. What we have here is a 2-float system. This bottom float, you just want to be at the same elevation as the top of this pump. The idea is that the pump will always, therefore, be submerged in water and it won't overheat. And then here, this top float, we have here a 4-inch minimum as high. I'd say you don't need to go any higher than 8 inches. So anywhere between 4 to 8 inches elevation difference between the bottom float and the top float. That's where you'll put that. That's simple. You can see here the floats will be already in a clip at their proper tether length, so no need to adjust that at all. That just needs to be slid on a 1-inch pipe for your float tree, your makeshift float tree, and just screwed into that pipe at the elevations that you want. We do prefer, as you can see, this is a long stretch of pipe. Going back a slide real quick. We do like that the floats are on a pipe that's resting at the bottom and just snapped into the side of the riser, as opposed to just down to here and the floats hanging. That way they just are for sure going to stay in the same place. You don't have to worry about this pipe sliding down if it's already resting on the bottom of the tank. We do go ahead and provide an orifice shield with a screw already started in it, prepped that way. Feel free to use that if you have another way that you like to attach your float trees to the riser. Feel free to use that as well, but that's just what we provide. And you can go ahead and just snap that float tree in place. You can see it's resting on the bottom of the tank, and so those floats will stay in their positions. You don't need to worry about those being adjusted at all. Here are the reverse flush headworks, as you can see on this drawing, on the pump tank. It's just on top of the tank there, in between those two riser lids, and that makes the connection from the pump to the headworks very short. It gives you thermal protection for that headworks being on top of the tank. It keeps it warmer, so that's good for the colder areas that this might be going into. And you can see it has a flush line, and it's going to go back into a 4-inch T that's provided, and that T is going to be spliced in between the two tanks. So over here is going to be that treatment vessel that we talked about in that larger picture. This 4-inch T, that's where we want that flush line going into. So just to be clear. For frost prevention in the Oscar II systems, it's important that we take into account and make sure that there are a couple components that are taken care of. Some of that has been things that are already put in place, for example, different components that are inside the headworks, and other things that the installer needs to take into account. So we'll just go ahead and walk through those regarding these 4 things: the Oscar coils and their manifolds, the sand itself, the headworks, and then the flush and supply lines. So here are some things to further make sure that any freezing is taken care of and this frost prevention is solid. The supply and flush lines, make sure that those are buried below the typical frost line in your area. Generally, there's an area that during the cold months, that depth that will get frozen. Just make sure that the supply and flush lines are below that when you're digging your trenches. The headworks themselves, make sure that those are surrounded and buried in soil, not something that has less of an insulative capacity. For example, sand. Cold will cut right through sand, so just make sure that you have soil or dirt actually surrounding the headworks when that's buried. The headworks, as mentioned before, have those directly on top of the pump tank, the tank itself that has some thermal protection being on top of the tank. The tanks, keep those a couple feet deep. If you are having everything really deep, to make sure that you still have access to the headworks, but that headworks is still deep and on top of the tank, we do provide riser extensions. We call riser extensions specifically for our headworks box, so make use of those, and we'll have slides later on to show how those work. If you don't have a headworks box that already has insulation in it, if you are in a cold area, go ahead and find some insulation just to put inside that box, just for belts and suspenders for that. The plumbing themselves already have the ability to drain in between dose cycles. We've removed all check valves from the system. So if you do have, for any reason, an older version that has some check valves provided, go ahead and remove those, or if you're installing them, don't put them in to begin with. And that allows everything to drain, and that pipe will stay relatively empty. A couple other things that prevent this freezing: the water is moving through the pipe frequently. When the system is active, the pump is kicking on every 4 minutes, and so moving water doesn't freeze. And so even if in between doses there is a little bit of freezing going on, that moving water will allow those pipe and the system to function regularly. The sand, it will freeze, but fortunately, because of how sand is, it doesn't stop the flow. So as water is being pumped out there, even if it's being pumped into a drain field of frozen sand, the water will still be able to move through that. So we found that isn't an issue. The coils and manifolds with no check valves being in the system will drain in between each dose, whether it's through the emitters of the drip tubing. All that water will continue to go out even in between when the pump is running, as well as those supply and flush lines with those check valves removed. They'll be able to drain back either through the drain field or back into the tank. If there is any vegetative growth on top of the drain field itself, whether it's grass or plants, that helps as a thermal protection as well. And also, good to remember that septic tank effluent is warmer than just water being out in the cold or being out in a couple of tanks, and so that all helps as well. So that water, being the water that's moving through, also helps frost. So all these things into account, if we're doing all of that, freezing should not be an issue with the Oscar 2 system. Here we are, and here's a picture of me, that good-looking guy right there, in a very cold area, in this area with an older system, as seen by this green box as opposed to our current black ones. That is a system that is working perfectly well with all of those things mentioned in the previous slides for frost prevention in place. So these systems can work and thrive even in very cold areas. So here's another picture of the reverse flush headworks, and we'll walk through some of the things that are in there to also help prevent frost going on. Here are your 4 connections. You'll have the pump coming in from this direction, and then the other 3 connections that you'll make is your supply and flush lines, and this will be that flush line that goes back to the tank, back into that 4-inch T in between the 2 tanks for the system on a residential application. So there are 3 king fittings, or what are called diaphragm fittings, that allow all this pipe in here to drain, placed in this. You can see there's kind of 2 tiers of this headworks. This bottom tier, so you have the top and bottom. So right here there's a king fitting, and then underneath these 2 side outs there are king fittings. So here's a look at the reverse flush from the bottom, and where these arrows are right here, here, and here, inside that plumbing, there are those king fittings that we'll walk through what they do to help prevent frost and allow that pipe to drain out. As you can see, there's the pump connection in the back, and then just these 3 connections, and that's all that as the installer you'll have to do. But those 3 king fittings allow each one of the functions that this headworks facilitates for all of those, regardless of what those doing, to still allow in between doses to drain out. So here's what the king fitting looks like. The water will come through this area, and how it works is when water is pressurized, so basically when the pump comes on and water is trying to get through the pipe through the king fitting from this side, there's a diaphragm fitting that prevents it, when it's pressurized, from going beyond that. But when the water isn't pressurized, so in between doses, the little stopper will allow water to dribble through this end of the king fitting, which is just the other side of that. So you see here, this little stopper, as water is trying to get through this side, it'll push this little black piece against that opening and won't allow any water. But as the pressure releases, that will be able to separate from that little hole, and the water will be able to flow through. And we have a video of what that looks like. Here we are. So this is in between doses, so this water in here isn't pressurized, it's just sitting in this pipe, and so in between dose, that's what's going on internally in this pipe. It's all able to drain out and go back through that flush line back into the tank. So all this pipe inside the reverse flush headworks is able to stay relatively open and free. We mentioned before about riser extensions. Essentially, it's another headworks box with the bottom cut out. So what you go ahead and do is you can place that directly on top of the headworks and just drill it in, and so your headworks will be right here, but you're able to have it further and deeper on top of the tank and still have access to it when everything is at grade and backfilled. It's important to note that the headworks box is about a foot tall, so just one of these riser extensions would allow that headworks, the bottom of that headworks, to be 2 feet deep and still have access to it. If you're at 18 inches or at a height less than 2 feet but higher than a foot, you'll be able to see, there's a picture of 2 of them on top of each other, you'll be able to see that you can makeshift and cut these corners off however much you need cut off from that 2 feet, and be able to drill in or to backfill with that in place. So they are able to be adjusted and have a riser extension then from the inside looking like that. And then just the lid that you would use for the headworks can be put on top of that riser extension as always, and it'll still have those brass fittings to be able to drill in each four corners the screws that are provided if you would like. So here's an example of what it looks like out in the field. It looks like this one has a riser extension using that full 2 feet because that's going to be the height of the risers, everything at grade, and you'll still have everything and easy access to the headworks when we're looking at that if you need to make subsequent visits after it's installed. So here's a look at the inside of our panel. The thing that's being noted on this slide is that we have a pressure switch. So in case that pre-treatment does require a blower or an aerator, we are able to put that little hose and tube using this headworks. But it is possible that you're putting an Oscar 2 in with a system that doesn't need a blower. And so this little breaker, you've got these 3 circuit breakers up here. This breaker is for the blower. And so we're able to disconnect that if need be and still use the same panel for a system that doesn't require an aerator or a blower. So the startup procedures. What we're about to go over is how to test and make sure that the system is working properly. The following, everything that we're calling the startup procedures, are the easiest way to diagnose if anything is off. Whether you're a new installer and you're putting one in just after new construction and you just want to make sure that everything's been wired correctly and there aren't any plugs or leaks someplace, this is what you would do. If you're an O&M provider or going to be and are checking on a system that's already been for a while that is perhaps getting an alarm, this startup procedure is the thing to do first to help you pinpoint where an issue might be. So this is important and has dual purpose in going over. The things that you'll be looking at and you'll want to do after every installation to make sure it's working. You heard that here first in the training. Do this after every installation, after it's been wired, to make sure that everything is proper. You'll make sure that the floats were wired correctly, that the pumps were wired correctly, that the valves were wired correctly, and we'll do that by looking at expected pressures and flows that we ought to see in that headworks. So just to go over real quickly the headworks specs, there is a 3/4 inch disc filter inside that headworks. That filter has a 120 mesh or 130 micron spec. There are 5 normally closed solenoid valves in there, and there are 3 pressure gauges. That will always be the case in each of our regular standard reverse flush headworks coming from Low Ridge. Here's a look at the panel, and we'll walk through which one of these toggle switches to flip to test what to make sure that we're doing these startup procedures correctly. So the main thing that the system is going to be doing is the pump is going to pump water via the reverse flush headworks out to the drip tubing, and there it'll stay. So it's just going to dose those coils. To test that, these top 2 toggle switches, we're going to flip in hand while everything else is in the off position. You can see that you have auto off in hand. That middle situation, that middle spot, that's where you want all of these toggle switches unless we're putting them in hand. That way we're controlling what's going on as we're testing everything. So top for pump, you'll notice that that label says pump 1 up there. You'll throw that in hand, and then this second toggle switch for valves 1 and 2, you'll put that in hand. When you do that, what you've done is you have sent electricity to solenoid valves 1 and 2, and you've had the pump running, so make sure there's water in the tank. And so that pump is going to pump water, and the flow of water is going to go through only what valves have been opened. So it'll go through valve 1. It can't go beyond here on the lower part because there's a king fitting, and it can't go beyond solenoid 4 because it's still closed. So water is forced to go through this disc filter, through valve 2, which has also been opened, down and around through the flow meter and this is your supply line going out to all those drip coils. So that's the flow of water when you do that. And the pressures to expect, gauges 1, 2, and 3, they'll always be labeled the same. On gauge 1, 2, and 3, they all should be about equal, floating around 50 psi. There'll be a little bit of leeway, particularly with gauge 3. Sometimes you'll see that be a little lower than what gauge 1 and 2. But gauge 1 and 2 should be about the same, and they all should be floating around 50 psi. So that's what you should expect. If something is different than that, then potentially you're running into maybe something wasn't wired correctly or something, but this is what to expect. So you see all these pressures on gauges 1, 2, and 3, then you know that everything's working right. Again, just to show the flow of water from the pump through the headworks to the supply line, and it's going and charging all of those coils. This is all pre-programmed in the panel, so you don't need to set this way. But just so you know, the default settings in the panel is that it's going to dose what we just showed. It's going to dose those coils 90 times in a row. Again, remember these are short, frequent doses. So every 4 minutes, the pump's going to kick on for about 30 seconds, and it's going to do that 90 times in a row. After those 90 doses, it's actually going to flush that disc filter. It's going to automatically flush that disc filter that's in that headworks for about 15 seconds. And then a dose after that is going to flush all those coils. So it's actually going to self-clean those coils in the drain field. And after it does that, it's going to go back to another 90 doses going out to the drain field. So that's all preset, but just so you know what's going on when you leave and everything's in auto, that's what's going on. So just to walk through a little bit of the mechanics of the disc filter flush, the only thing that's not included in this picture is that there is a spring on the inside of this lid holding all of these, I call them poker trips, but these little discs, holding all of those tight in place. So as dirty water is being pumped through, all the little organics or little chunks are actually going to get caught in between all of these poker chips, and then the water that's able to get in there and go through and leave the disc filter is all going to be cleaned water or filtered water, because all of the stuff that's getting caught in between those discs are going to stay there. Now to flush that, what we're going to do is we're going to keep this pump in hand, but then we're also going to put, instead of 1 and 2, valves 3 and 4, we're going to put that in hand. And so flow of water, instead of going through 1, now that's closed, so it's going to go through valve 3. It's going to be forced to go through the backlet, or this back end of the disc filter, instead of the forward way, through valve 4. That's going to go down below to this bottom tier, and it's going to go through this connection, which is that flush line to the tank, into that 4-inch T in between the two tanks. So that's where all that's going. So what's happening here is that spring that's at the top of this disc filter, with the water being pressurized this way, it's forcing that spring to compress and allow space to open up in between all of those poker chips. And so all that water is actually going to be flushing all of that out back to the beginning of the system. So it's not going very far. That pump is going to kick on. It's going to go through the headworks the way that was just outlined and back into that 4-inch T. And then the impact of all that water is going to hit here first, so that by the time it's coming back into the tank, it's a nice, easy flow. But it still will be, I say nice, easy flow, it will be a good amount of flow because the pump isn't going very far. So just about everything that pump can handle pumping is going to go just directly through here. So it's not a far journey that the water is going. And then finally, we're going to test the coil flush. So how this works is that we're going to keep the pump in hand. We're going to flip back valves 1 and 2 into hand because we want water to be able to get out to those coils. And then in addition, that fifth valve, valve 5, we're going to throw that toggle switch in hand. So flow of water, same as before when we were dosing the coils. It's going to go through one, through the disc filter, through two, up and around, through the flow meter, and then that's going to go to all the coils. What's going to happen is, because the pump pumps more water than those coils can get rid of, you're going to have a lot of excess water going through all of those coils and actually making it back through this flush line that now can go through this bottom part of the headworks back into the tank, because we're also going to open up valve 5. And so the pressures that you should expect to see on gauges 1, 2, and 3 are on gauges 1 and 2. They'll be about equal. There'll be a little bit of a variability, but floating around 40 psi. Sometimes 1 will be at 40 and maybe 2 will be at 38 or vice versa. That's fine, but so long as they're in the ballpark of 40 psi. And gauge 3, since it has water freely flowing through it, it'll be pretty much non-existent. So we'll say anywhere between 0 and 3 psi, but that should drop just about all the way. So to illustrate what I was talking about on how these coils are flushed, it's a forward flush. So this red is representing the water going out there and dosing those coils. Like I said, because this tubing, it's pressure compensating emitter, so it's only going to get rid of a certain amount. The pump is pumping more water than that certain amount will be. And so this flush line, so water will go through all these coils, but then there'll be an excess that actually is filling up this flush line. And instead of stopping at the headworks of that valve 5, since we're opening up that valve 5, it'll actually allow that water to continue to flush all the way back into the tank. And so that excess water will be enough to clean out those coils regularly throughout the day. Next, we're going to talk about how to measure flow using the flow meter that's in our headworks, which is going to be this Netafim 3/4 inch flow meter. So here you'll see, closer look at it, you'll have these black numbers here on this flow counter. This 2 and 2, you'll notice, aren't for 22, but this 2 right here is representing hundreds, so that's actually representing 200. And here, this 2 is representing 20. And you have this painted 0 for the single digits, and those will all be represented in the dials down here. So this dial furthest to the right, each notch here is a gallon. So when it goes from 0 to 1, that's 1 gallon, a single gallon that's gone by. Here, in this middle dial, which is the dial we'll be using further on, as will be demonstrated later on in this training video, each notch here is 1/10 of a gallon. And furthest over to the left, each notch here is 1/100 of a gallon. So as water is spinning through and going through this flow meter, this furthest to the left will be spinning a lot faster because it's measuring a much smaller amount of water going through as opposed to this. And this middle dial will be spinning faster than this one furthest to the right. So if you were to read this flow meter as it is right now, you'd say that there's 220 gallons, and you don't even have quite another gallon right here. You have about 0.6 here and about 0.04 here. So currently, this still shot of the flow meter, you're looking at a flow of 220 gallons and 0.64 having gone through this flow meter. So when you're doing the startup procedures, this is the one time you'll have to do some math to make sure, because this will be site specific. It's important to know how many Oscar coils you have out in the drain field. As mentioned at the very beginning of this training video, you have 2 sizes of Oscar coils. You have an OS 50, which can handle 50 gallons a day design flow, and an OS 100. Each OS 50 coil can get rid of 0.35 gallons per minute. And an OS 100 can get rid of twice as much. So for the arbitrary example, if you had a drain field with 10 OS 50s in it, then to find out how much that whole drain field can get rid of, you take your 10 OS 50 coils and multiply it by how much gallons per minute each coil can get rid of, 0.35, and that leaves you with 3.5 gallons per minute that whole drain field can get rid of. And so that's what you'd be testing for. So just number of coils times the amount of water per minute that each one of those coils can get rid of, and that'll give you your total gallons per minute flow for the drain field. So the things to record, you'll want to record all the pressures on gauges 1, 2, and 3, and the flow that's happening during the dose. Because that flow, you'll know what it should be based on how many coils are out there. So when you'll do that, you'll wait for all those gauges to pressurize, record those gauges, and once the gauges are pressurized, do a flow reading looking at that middle dial, if you remember up here, and after those gauges are pressurized, time for a minute and count how many times that goes around. Each full rotation is going to be a gallon, and that's how you'll know how much flow over the course of a minute your drain field is getting rid of. The last thing in this training video, you're almost done, ladies and gentlemen, is the certification process. So if you're watching this video right now as a new installer looking to be on our certified professionals list on Low Ridge's website so you can install Low Ridge products, the first step is a classroom training, which could be a literal class that you go to for that we hold, but generally it's just going to be watching this video, which you've just done, so good on you. Next, after you've watched this video, give Dave a call, and his number was on that front slide, and it'll also be on this final slide. And you'll have a little conversation about this video, any questions that you have. We don't expect you to retain everything from this video. This is just to give you an overview before you actually install one. At that point, you'll be put on our list on our website. And then, from there, when you're installing your first one, you'll let us know, and a representative from Low Ridge will actually come out on site with you during the install to walk through, refresh your memory from watching this video, and walk through all the nuanced things specific to Low Ridge. And once the install has happened, then it'll get electronically hooked up. And once the electrician is finished hooking everything up, we'll go through together, so there'll be, generally speaking, a second on-site visit from someone from Low Ridge to walk through all of those startup procedures that we went through. And then if there's any additional training that's needed or requested, we'll take care of that. But that is the entirety of the certification process for this. So you've done good on watching this video as the first step on installing and being a certified professional for Low Ridge. Well, you did it. Thank you for watching the Oscar II installation video for Washington State. Again, if you have any questions following a conversation that you'll have with Dave Lau, his phone number's right here. Go ahead and give him a call if you're looking to get certified. You can also follow up with any just questions that you have on your own for your own edification at our website at oscaronsite.com. And that's also where you'll find some of the lists that we mentioned throughout the training videos, such as our certified professionals list or that list of approved treatment vessels or septic tanks for our systems. That's all going to be on this website. Thank you again for listening and taking a chance with Low Ridge On-Site Technologies. We look forward to talking to you. Have a great day.